This sounds a little heavy, I suppose, but one of the reasons I'm giving a series of talks is because a lot of people, they've heard about God, they've probably studied God in their own religion of choice, but they don't necessarily know where that idea came from. So the first talk I gave 2 weeks ago was about going back into the Neolithic era, about 40 to 60,000 years ago, into what would be commonly called the caveman era, but they still had the same brain that you and I have today, just not very well developed in terms of skills, but definitely had the capacity to do all the same thinking and emotionally feel everything just like you and I do. And so I talked about that, and I talked about how the regeneration of the cycles of the moon sort of gave us an indication anthropologically that this is how they sort of figured out how cycles happen in death, birth, and regeneration, because as the moon would come into existence and then pass out of existence and disappear for 3 days, we have pretty good evidence that that's where people started to form the idea of a cycle of life. And then I talked about last week, I talked about the nature of the great above and the great below, and where do we get those ideas, and I talked about the great caves in France and Spain, where the caves were known as the deeper you went, it was almost like an initiation into life, which is metaphorically saying the same thing within who you are as a person. The deeper you go inside your life, the more you're initiated into what's called the mystery of life. So today I want to talk about clarity, and also want to talk about the Greek influence upon the evolution of the idea of God. So to get us started, I've got Reverend Liz Loma, who's going to read to you from the front of your program something I wrote in a book I wrote about Jesus, about clarity.
Clarity. Who in their right mind would be thankful when their instincts are telling them that something's wrong or someone's not right? The untrained mind will replay the memory of failure and seek to dominate or run. The trained mind will see the opportunity to forgive the failure and seek to heal the habit and feeling of debt. Forgive our debts to the extent that we have forgiven those in debt to us. Matthew 6:12. The untrained mind will go into the darkness of depression and try to explain the memory by assigning blame and shame to all guilty parties. Then try to remove the blame and shame through a sort of pretend forgiveness that intellectually forgives, but never emotionally forgets. The trained mind will dismiss the darkness and live in the light of expressed gratitude for all that it has experienced and accepts that a greater good is now rushing into its experience. Take care then that the light within you is not darkness. If then your whole body is flooded with light and no corner of it is darkness, it will be completely illuminated as when a lamp's rays engulf you. Luke 11:35.
Thanks. So, we're talking about the trained mind versus the untrained mind. And a lot of people that I run into don't have their minds trained to handle conditions and circumstances as they encounter them. Most people, when they encounter difficulties, they either go to fear or flight, or they go to this sort of like numbness or this vagueness, and they become indifferent about things, what we call in psychology denial. But in this philosophy, we're asking people to be accountable for not only how they feel, but how they behave. But if we don't give you a set of tools that helps you do that, then it really wouldn't be functional. So one of the things that the Greeks gave to philosophy is the beginning of the inquiry into the universe itself. Because Greeks were just so well noted for looking at the empirical evidence of life. And what we call the presocratic philosophers, those are the philosophers that were before Socrates, about maybe 800, 700 years ago, had this concept that they started to see earth, air, fire, and water as being the primary elements of life, and how these elements mixed determined how life would turn out. But more importantly, is they began to also refer to these things metaphorically or internally, that there was a fire in each person, there was an earthiness about each person, there was a flux about each person that was sort of like water, and an ethereal sense like air. So as they began to draw these ideas together, they began to form conclusions about how life works or doesn't work. But in the process of doing that, they also said there seemed to be other controlling forces. And so the Greeks dreamed up this amazing mythology of Greek gods and goddesses. As a matter of fact, most religion that had to do with God, well, all religions that have to do with God, were initially what we call polytheistic. In other words, there were many gods. There wasn't just one God, there was many gods. And so you could turn to the god of this or the god of that, and you could pray in different ways. But they also were really into sacrifice. And so they would sacrifice animals and sometimes people. And they would make these very important ceremonies because they were trying to influence, because they saw God as external to their being. Now that still goes on today, not sacrificing people or animals, of course, but sacrificing ourselves. So many people have this sort of self-sacrificial, almost self-sabotaging ability to just put yourself down, keep yourself under control, don't expect too much, don't anticipate too much, just kind of try and live low profile and hope nothing goes wrong or seriously bad, or if it does, that maybe you've got some Irish luck that can get you through. So they would make up all kinds of things about, the Irish made up leprechauns. And what was the thing about leprechauns? If you could grab the leprechaun, what would he have to give you? The pot of gold, right? So, many people are looking for that small, short guy. A friend of mine, Paul Williams, who comes to the church in case, he's a very short guy, he would say that when he'd go to Ireland and play golf, they would grab him and say, where'd you hide the gold, you little bastard? So, short people have it rough. But the mythologies that people attach to various things do tend to play out in personalities, too. And so the nature of God was very complex in the Greek system. And of course, not everybody, however, in the Greek system believed in this polytheistic or many gods tradition. As a matter of fact, one of the greatest philosophers, Socrates, had a different point of view. And his point of view was that there was really just one power, and that everything was emanating out of that presence, which is very much the philosophy of this particular teaching that we teach. And then his student, Plato, came up with another idea called the theory of ideas. And Plato's ideas this was his idea. There was one perfect human, and that each of us were variations of that perfection. I'll say that again. There is one perfect human, and each of us is a variation of that perfection. And he says there's one perfect chair, and all other chairs are variations of what it means to be chair and the perfection of what it means to be chair. So for everything that you could imagine in the universe, there was one perfect idea, and all other things that were like that were variations of that idea. And of course, this was not popular necessarily in the Greek society, because the Greeks really ran into what we call mystery religions, which is that, like I told you last week, we talked about the business of going into the cave, where the Greeks were very much into this mystery, and they would form small groups, and they would have, each group had its own mystery and way of explaining the mystery, and it was like secret rites, much like secret organizations you would belong to. So there was these what we call mystery cults all around the Mediterranean. And one of those cults, as a matter of fact, when I was in college and I was a music major, and I joined Phi Nu Alpha, which is the professional music fraternity, and then they had this initiation, which I wasn't even aware of. I thought I was just signing up to be a professional musician, but then they go to this secret thing. But I can tell you, it was the play of the whole concept of going into the underworld and reclaiming a beautiful woman. But if you turned around as you were walking out of the underworld, you would turn into salt. That's the same story that shows up in the Bible, by the way, in many other mythologies. And so a lot of people have these very odd and strange mythologies attached, but there was a whole set of Greeks, Socrates included, and Plato one of them, that said, no, we want to look at this from a different angle, that we didn't, even though we saw earth, air, fire, and water, and various things mixing, but there seemed to be this presence, this essence, which is almost undefined, but nonetheless there, everywhere you looked. And so Plato and Socrates engaged in that. Of course, we don't know what Socrates said exactly, because he wrote nothing down that we're aware of. Everything that we know about what he said was either from Plato, his student, or from Xenophon, a historian, or from Aristophanes, was a playwright at the time, who wrote some things about Socrates. As a matter of fact, he even wrote a play about Socrates as being the pink cloud of the physician. Because Socrates, if you don't know, was put on trial for corrupting the youth of Athens. And what he was saying to them was, you don't have to believe in all these gods, you don't have to do sacrifices, you could just be yourself. And for that he paid the ultimate price, which was his life. But Socrates, oddly enough, was never scared of dying, because early in his youth, he went through what's called almost catatonic states of meditation, where it was known for a fact that he would literally sit still sometimes for up to 2 days without food or water in perfect stillness. And his mother would ask him, what was going on? And he would say, I was always being guided. As a matter of fact, she even took him to the oracle at Delphi to get an answer. What's wrong with my son? And the oracle said, nothing. He just happens to be perhaps going to be one of the greatest philosophers and thinkers that ever lived. Now Socrates, not me, and of course it turns out that he was one of the greatest philosophers that ever lived, had this huge impact upon society, still having an impact upon every person in this room, because he is famous for saying, it is the unexamined life that is not worth living. And he said, you gotta keep examining your life. You gotta keep thinking about who you are and what you're turning into. And last week I talked about my favorite F word, flux. I love the word flux because it really portrays the actual condition that most people are in. Most people don't see themselves in flux. They see themselves pretty well established in sort of like some sort of solid experience, but the truth of the matter is, you're always changing, continually. And life is constantly offering you different opportunities to grow. Now, some people call that difficulties. We call it simply the opportunities to polish the mirror. Matter of fact, there's a quote from Rumi. It's one of my favorite quotes. It says, if you're irritated by every rub, how will your mirror ever be polished? If you're irritated by every rub, how will your mirror be polished? In other words, you know that old saying about what creates a pearl inside of an oyster or a shell? It's a piece of sand that creates such an irritation that the pearl forms around that irritation. Same thing is true with the truth about who you are and what you're becoming. And so when you're irritated, sometimes people come to my office and they're irritated. I don't mind the irritation because I know what's happening. They're polishing the mirror. And to give you a little clearer idea, if you hold your right hand out in front of you like this, and you put your left hand on your chest, and you say, this is a reflection, say that, of what's going on in here. See, now, if I'm unhappy with something out here, and I'm hitting that, stop it. I can't solve the problem. I can't solve the problem by beating up something outside of myself, and I can't solve it by beating myself up something inside of myself. I have to accept, wait a minute, it's trying to tell me something. It's trying to show me something. And so it's very important that you listen to even the things that irritate you, which is why Jesus said, learn how to love your enemies, because they've got important information. And so when you learn how to do that, and you start to take into this whole concept that the Greeks, like Socrates and Plato, and Aristotle, the final third guy, who was known for his empirical sense. Aristotle wasn't like Plato and Socrates. He said, no, you gotta prove it to me. You gotta prove to me that these things exist. And so he was sort of the father of the modern scientific method. You all know the scientific method. You've got a hypothesis, and then you've got experiments, and you have the outcome, and then you have the conclusion. Did you prove that this was the truth? So Aristotle was very pragmatic in his approach. And there was another fellow that was very pragmatic and an influence upon American thought and American religion, William James, who was the father of modern American philosophy and psychology, who was the dean of the Harvard Medical School in the early 1900s. But William James's life is fascinating because his whole first 33 or 34 years of his life was lived in a tremendous depression. He was so depressed he considered suicide several times. But he changed his mind after he made an attempt to go up the Amazon River, which I suspect would change anybody's mind. So he made this attempt to go up the Amazon River, decided that he couldn't do it, went back to America, and sat around and thought to himself, you know, I have to start making, now this is going to sound ridiculously simple, better choices. Here's a guy, touted as being the father of modern psychology. He says, I got to start making better choices. So he said, the first thing I'm going to do is to free my will. And he made this statement, I now have a free will that has the capacity to do anything that I want. Has the capacity to do anything I want. Now, Aristotle, in his own effort, did a similar thing. He freed his own will to make that exploration into the qualities of life, because that's what he was concerned with, was the qualities. Plato was concerned with the variations, Aristotle with the qualities. Socrates was the oneness. All of that came together, of course, to influence a tremendous impact upon Western thought. Western thought has ever since then been sort of had this dichotomy and this sort of complexity about trying to analyze ourselves, figure things out, and we owe that to the Greeks. But at some point, you stop analyzing things. At some point, you stop that. Because at some point, you have to surrender to a power greater than yourself that can literally transform the entire experience of your life if you're willing to let it. Which is why I really want to make this a habit, this prayer thing a habit, because this is how you do it. What you do is you put prayer into motion, which sets everything in the universe conspiring for you to have what you desire. Now, I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, and I've used this example before, but it's absolutely clear in my mind. I had a friend of mine who was called up and said that he had cancer right above his tooth, in this part of his face, and they asked me to go to the hospital right after an operation. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to see. I walked into the room, and they had removed his entire face, and then they removed his entire part of here and his whole eye, which had cancer in this, and they sewed his face back on, and he had this big, huge bandage, and all these tubes coming out, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this before. I'm not a surgeon. I mean, I've never seen anything like that in my life. I had to immediately detach myself from what I was looking at. I had to say, that's not the truth of who this person is. And then I had to start thinking, what is the truth? Something within this person knew exactly what it was doing, what it needed to happen, and was healing this person right now. And I stood there for about 45 minutes with that consciousness in mind. And I talked to him. Can you imagine that, talking to this person after an operation like that? And I kept saying to this person, you are whole, you are perfect, and you are complete. And that's what I know. Now, the reason I had established that consciousness, because I was shocked, I was overwhelmed with the seeing, and I couldn't quite believe it. But I said, you know, something within me knows what to do here. And so I kept saying these three words over and over again in my heart. Whole, perfect, complete. Say it. Whole, perfect, complete. Say it again. Whole, perfect, complete. Now, as you say those words to yourself, it's easier to say them about somebody else than about yourself. Because the tendency is not to know yourself as whole, perfect, and complete. Except for somebody like me, who I recently told my wife, I'm the most wonderful man in the world. I'm just teasing. Anyway, but when you know yourself as whole, perfect, and complete, you operate at a completely different level of confidence. You operate at a level of confidence that says, I know I'm attached to a power that absolutely functions by means of my consciousness. And when I think this way, it not only sends out a vibration, but it creates a consciousness for everything around me to be peaceful and to be healed. So the words are whole, perfect, and complete. Now this week I was out of town. I was visiting a relative, and I had to be in a hospital room looking at a person who was suffering from multiple problems, serious problems. Might not even make it through. And I kept thinking to myself, I don't live in the don't make it through world. I live in the world. What world do I live in? So because I live in that whole perfect and complete world, I could stand on faith. I could stand on faith that says, whatever needs to happen here, now happens for the best and highest good of all people. Now, not everybody is ready to hear that, but that doesn't mean I can't think that. It doesn't mean that I can't stand perfectly confident in my own faith about anybody I'm looking at, with the whole perfect and complete truth in my heart and my mind. Now, Aristotle saw it a little differently too. Aristotle was walking along one day, and he saw a dead cow. This is a little gross, but he pulled the eyes out of the cow, and he held the eyes up, and he saw that the eyes still functioned as a lens. That he could actually, what does a lens do? It turns what? It turns things upside down. So he could see the world upside down through the eye of the cow. And you know the conclusion he drew? Something was in the cow looking out. Something was in the cow looking out through the eyes. Now that might not seem like a big deal to you, but doggone it, when you want to know that there's something within you, these are just lenses, and something in you is looking out at the world. And it's looking at the world, and something's converting that version right side up, even though the lens sees it upside down. Because the truth of the matter is, most of humanity is upside down in their thinking. I even have a little story. I'm thinking, what if you ever go down to like Newport and you see all those sailboats sitting in the bay? Well, what if you saw them upside down? What if you went to the bay and you saw all the sailboats upside down, and all that was exposed was the keels? Well, wouldn't you think that was odd? See, and that's the way a mystic looks upon humanity. A mystic sees, isn't it odd that people are thinking so upside down? And when we want to go down there, and people would be sitting at their boats, and they'd be spending the day washing the bottoms of their boats, not knowing that they were upside down. And you would say to them, what? That boat's upside down. Turn it right side up, and it can function. That's the way every great spiritual person thinks. They're looking at people who are upside down. So all you got to do is, where do you turn the boat over? You can't tell them to turn your boat over. You turn it over in your own mind. You say, turn that boat upside down. Turn that boat right side up. Let's right side everything in this world. And let's start to create a world where we live in the present moment and not in the future or the past, in worry or in fear, but we live in peace, and we actually practice peace. So I have a little poem I read today. I want to leave this with you. It says, I can't control my destiny. I trust my soul. My only goal is just to be. There's only now. There's only here. Give in to love or live in fear. No other path, no other way, no day but today. You have the opportunity to change your mind right now. To say, I'm whole, perfectly complete, and I choose to see the world exactly that way. And that's clarity. Thank you.